All right, so my name is Amanda Grady, and I am going to be presenting on No Child Left Behind. So the No Child Left Behind Act of 2011 was pretty controversial, and I imagine that many of you have actually heard about it. So before I even get started with the presentation, I would like to have a discussion with you, which obviously is a little bit weird because I'm not there. But my discussion question for you is, what do you already know about No Child Left Behind? I'm sure you guys have heard a lot of different things, and I just want to kind of get it out there what you already know before we get started and I teach you a little bit more about it. So this would be a great time for you guys to pause the video and have the discussion. Okay, so I'm sure that was an invigorating discussion. Sorry I wasn't there for it. But we are going to move on. So just to start off, No Child Left Behind was actually a reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. And really what President Bush was trying to do is he recognized that there were some holes in the public education system, and he really wanted to renovate it and kind of revise it to meet the needs of society currently. He thought he would do this through establishing some very high standards and really measurable goals that he wanted students to be able to accomplish, and he wanted to test them using pretty high stakes standardized tests, which I'm sure you guys talked about it in your discussion, but that's what he thought he would do. There were a couple of cornerstones that was the focus of No Child Left Behind. The very first one, he wanted an increased accountability for schools. So he noticed that some schools performed well and some didn't, and he wanted to show us which schools were those and make them accountable for what they were teaching their children. The second cornerstone was he wanted a greater parent and student choice of schools through the use of these things called vouchers. So, if parents and students thought that they were not getting a quality education at one school, they had certain steps that they could go through to get vouchers, which would allow them to go to schools that they thought were of higher quality or were performing better. The third cornerstone of No Child Left Behind was he thought that they had more flexibility regarding spending federal educational funds. So, because these schools had to reach these certain goals, they had a lot more flexibility once they did about where they spent their money and what they wanted to focus on. The last cornerstone of No Child Left Behind is that it placed a very strong emphasis on reading, especially for younger kids. So he recognized that younger children really needed a lot of support when it came to reading, and he implemented that as a cornerstone of No Child Left Behind. Okay, so while initially believed to be the answer to the achievement gap, especially between minority and non-minority students, in practice, No Child Left Behind often had kind of a negative impact on students, and particularly those of Latino backgrounds, which I'll get to in a second. First were these vouchers. Now, the vouchers, what they would do is they actually subsidize the cost of moving a child from a failing school in the public educational system to a parochial or a private school, which gave the impression that these students would now be allowed to receive a very successful quality education. So all of these parents and all of these students thought that this was going to be the answer to their problems. What they didn't realize is that attending these schools actually carried some monetary and social implications that they just failed to understand initially, and so it didn't work out exactly the way they planned, and oftentimes it just left people very unhappy. The second issue I want to bring up is that schools that didn't meet adequate yearly progress lost their funding. We've heard about this time and time again. Schools were expected to meet certain goals as demonstrated by the table on the right, where they were supposed to be all proficient by a certain year, and each year they had to raise up a certain percentage of their students achieving those goals. So if you did not meet adequate yearly progress, you lost some funding. And it's ironic that that happened because oftentimes the low income, low performing schools that could potentially most benefit from additional funding and support were being stripped of those resources that could really help them improve. And as we know, oftentimes these kind of schools had a very high population of minority students. And now I will be discussing No Child Left Behind and its effects on Latinos and other minority groups. So the very first thing that came from the implementation of No Child Left Behind was kind of a spark in the overrepresentation and overidentification of minority students in special education. So these were students that are not only referred to but also receiving these services. So, if the student's first language was not English, then they clearly suffered from taking those tests. Therefore, they were identified as having learning disabilities. Next, I would like to discuss the unfortunate trend that schools not meeting AYP had a higher percentage of minority students than those that were meeting adequate yearly progress, meaning that Latino students who attended these schools weren't receiving as many funds or as many services as those who were meeting AYP and had the stigma of attending a failing school. So that obviously has implications on them socially and personally as a student. Lastly, states often refused to administer standardized tests in the students' native languages, which forced them to take the same test as their English-speaking counterparts, again, even if it wasn't their first language. So, if the students were being expected to take tests in English when their first language was Spanish, they were set up to fail once more. Obviously, these were pretty negative implications for Latino students, and in conclusion, I think that instead of lifting all students up with regards to education and closing the achievement gap, the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001 actually further oppressed minority and low-income students. Thank you guys so much for listening to me present, and Jen will be up next.
All right, I'm going to be talking about Race to the Top. Race to the Top promoted innovation, reform, and excellence in America's public schools. This is a quote that was issued by President Obama on July 24th, 2009. And even though Race to the Top was designed to help all schools in the United States, it especially targeted struggling schools and failing schools. And it's going to help these schools and children that are most in need and which are mostly populated by Latinos and other minority students, which we know make up most of the population in these types of schools. So what is Race to the Top? So President Obama and the Secretary of Education, they presented the states with an extraordinary challenge and the opportunity to compete in the Race to the Top type of reform. So it was designed to encourage like a systematic reform and embrace innovation approaches so that schools will have new ways of teaching their students, and also just so everyone is on the same level and working for the same goals. And it was a 4.35 billion United States Department of Education contest. And it is funded by the Education Recovery Act as part of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009. So this act is an economic stimulus package that was presented by President Obama to immediately save and create jobs. It was also enacted to provide temporary relief programs for those most impacted by the recession and invest in infrastructure, education, health, and the green energy. And Race to the Top was just one of these types of programs. The reforms contained in the Race to the Top will help prepare America's students to graduate and also to prepare them for college and give them ready for careers, and also most importantly, enable them to outcompete any worker anywhere in the world. So Race to the Top, they give awards to states and schools that satisfy certain education policies. Now, these are some of the policies that they would get awarded for. For example, designing and implementing rigorous standards and high-quality assessments, attracting and keeping great teachers and leaders in America's classrooms, supporting data systems that inform decisions and improve instruction, using innovation and effective approaches to turn around struggling schools, and demonstrating and sustaining education reform. So these are all policies that will help improve these schools and provide a better education for their students. States need to implement these policies into their schools as well as improve them. Now, this is the scoring process that all the schools will be scored on based on their criterion, and they receive a total of 500 points for each criterion. And the more points they get, the more money they will be awarded with. So the states will submit an application for funding, and there's 3 different phases where they'll go through the process of getting evaluated. And then the state applications for funding are scored, and these are the things that they're scored on, and they're in order of weight. So there's great teachers and leaders for 138 points, state success factors 125, standards and assessments 70, general selection criteria 55, turning around the lowest achieving schools 50, data systems to support instruction 47, And then you get an extra 15 points if you have STEM education in your school, so science, technology, engineering, and math. Now I'd like you guys to discuss if you think Race to the Top is an accurate way to measure and also motivate schools in performing better. So take a couple minutes to do that. So even though Race to the Top has been beneficial for our schools, there are some criticism that's being made by politicians, policy analysts, and other leaders. And basically, it's because Race to the Top, the test that they're using to evaluate the schools might not be an accurate way to measure teachers, as is shown in the past, how we already know that they're not always an accurate way to measure things by just one test score. Also, they complain that imposes federal control on states, and it also shows that testing is unreliable and then that charter schools weaken public education. So these are just some criticism that's being made about Race to the Top. Okay, so some of the effects that states and communities are doing across the nation because of the Race to the Top reform is that they are redesigning their curriculum and their lesson plans to meet the same standards of Race to the Top in order to qualify for the criteria. So, for example, in New Haven, they ratified a new 4-year contract for their teachers, and they also changed the evaluation system for their teachers that includes student learning gains. So they'll take the assessment of how the students did and use that to evaluate the teachers. They're also providing interventions for struggling teachers, and they promoted a new process for changing the traditional schools and converting them into charter schools. States are also using a value-added model for teacher evaluations, and what this is, it's comparing the teacher's students' test scores to her test scores or his or her test scores from the previous year, as well as comparing the scores to students in the same grade level. So even though some states had previously banned this model, they had to add it in order to be eligible for the Race to the Top, and it also prompted 48 states to adopt common standards for K through 12 grades, and having the majority of these states adopt the common standards will help make schools more uniform as a whole in the United States.